Welcome to the final week of our fall message series we've been calling 8th Grade Faith. Our series concept has basically been that many of us have essentially an 8th grade level of faith, that many of us saw confirmation as a sort of graduation from church, and that we haven't really grown in faith since that point, leaving us at an 8th grade level of faith. And we're not saying that this makes you a bad person, but it is a distinct disadvantage that can actually, in some ways, handicap us for the challenges of adult living. So this series has been about moving on to a more useful approach when it comes to our faith. To tell you the truth, I'm always a little sad to see a series end, because they're like familiar friends that you get used to after a while. But in a certain sense, our series is always accessible. If you've missed any or all of the previous weeks of this series, or if you know someone you just can't wait to share this with, you can always access them online. Just go to stalfrancis.net and click on Messages. As we wrap up today, we're addressing one last aspect of this topic of maturing in faith, where God ultimately wants to take us and what he uses to get us there. We're looking at St. Paul's second letter to Timothy, which is in the New Testament. Timothy was a disciple of Paul's, more like a son than a student to him. At the time that this letter was written, Paul was coming to the end of his life, so he's giving some of the most heartfelt and urgent instruction that he ever gave to Timothy. At one point, he warns Timothy that leading a church is not easy, and I'll second that. He warns Timothy that he will have battles to fight, disappointments to bear, and suffering to endure. Paul writes this: "Indeed, all who want to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted." So there's some sombering words and comforting words, right? If you want to be a Christ follower, sooner or later, it's going to cost you something. You might lose a relationship or a friendship. You might have to sacrifice time that you could have used for yourself. You might even be misunderstood by others. Paul says that if you want to be a Christ follower, there is a price to be paid. Now that shouldn't really come to us as a huge surprise, since the main symbol for the Christian faith is a man nailed to a cross. 11 of the 12 apostles died a martyr's death. Saying that the Christian faith will be difficult and challenging should not be a surprise to us. And yet sometimes it is. I think in the church that there are two common errors when it comes to this truth. On the one hand, we can overemphasize it. And we all know people like that. There are these old-timey religious types who just want to circle the wagon with other true believers and hunker down in a religion of penance and mortification, where God is always angry and the end is near. The number of times we've had people refuse to come to our church because we must be Catholic light, because we're too upbeat, because we actually smile here, and because maybe we're having too much fun. And they don't always mean that as a compliment either. Well, this perspective neglects the joy and blessing that God promises. It lacks a lively appreciation for the rewards that come from following Christ. We aren't called to just carry the cross in circles. We're supposed to go to Calvary to die, but then to rise again. Jesus spoke about sacrifice, but he always connected sacrifice to the promise of some reward in this life and in the next. On the other hand, some of us were formed in a faith that shied away from the difficult parts. It was all rainbows and unicorns and warm fuzzies. I even remember a time in religion class growing up where the answer to every question was always love. Any question you ask about faith, the answer is always love. Really? What about when things go wrong? And they do. Obviously, this approach ignores the depth and the weight of our Christian faith. It's only messages, we're all okay. Just try to be a good person and everything's always going to be fine. It's fine to have this kind of sunny attitude until life happens. And life always happens. And things don't end up working out for us so well. And maybe you've been there. You lose your job, or a close friend betrays you. You lose a loved one, or your marriage falls apart. And all of a sudden, you're no longer okay. I'm no longer okay. There's a gap between expectation and reality. And in that gap, I feel like faith, or at least my version of it anyway, has let me down. Well, if you follow Jesus, you will for sure see God come through for you. You'll see God's power and blessing in awesome and unexpected ways. But you will still experience difficulties. Now, Paul doesn't want Timothy to be taken off guard by this, so he counsels him, and he goes on, continue in what you have learned and firmly believe, knowing from whom you learned it, and how from childhood you have known the sacred writings that are able to instruct you for salvation through faith in Christ Jesus. So Paul challenges Timothy to remain faithful despite the coming trials and tribulations, relying on the wisdom of the Bible, the reading of which is a big part of what it is to be a Christ follower. And then St. Paul concludes, be persistent whether the time is favorable or unfavorable. So, to be a committed Christ follower, it requires persistence with a view of the whole reality of our Christian faith. Now, whatever your view of the Christian faith, dark and gloomy or sunny and rainbow-colored, or hopefully a little bit more balanced somewhere in the middle, when it comes to following Christ, we all tend to fall into one of three possible categories. And I'm just going to break them down for you now. The first group I'll call consumer Christians. As a consumer, I show up. That's what I do. The rest is on the church. I don't give, I don't serve, and I don't participate. I don't want to meet people, and I don't want to talk to anybody. I just show up. Sometimes before Mass, I'm outside greeting people. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard our greeters say, hello, welcome, we're glad you're here. And have people just zip by them saying, I'm just here for Mass. I'm just here for Mass. It happens a lot. Like, I don't want to talk to people. I don't want to smile. I'm just here for Mass. I don't want anything else, just Mass. Now, some of these people come in late and leave early, but they're here for Mass. I come because my kids like the kids program. I come because I like the music. I come because I'm supposed to, or to get my mom or my grandma off my back. I come to consume communion because that's what I should do. Now, I should note that we all start at this level. And if that's you today, if you're a visitor, if this is your first time back in a long time, you're going to consume. And that's exactly what you should be doing. But if we stay there, if we never grow, then our faith isn't actually very useful to us at all. It's exceptionally easy to find yourself falling out of the practice of faith altogether, because a one-sided consumer exchange can easily become boring. And it's boring because you don't bring anything to it. A one-sided consumer exchange is always going to be boring. The second level is what I like to call comfortable contributors. This would be like, I believe in the gospel enough to contribute, but only in a way that fits my lifestyle. At this level, we think along the lines of, I'll go to church as long as the kids don't have a game, or as long as the Leafs aren't playing. I'll give to the collection as long as I have some spare change. I'll serve, but not now. I'll follow Jesus as long as there's no risk, as long as I can blend into the culture around me. It's natural for us to want to remain comfortable contributors because moving on can be uncomfortable. But the problem is that this approach, though it starts differently, lands you in the exact same place as the first approach, that of the consumer approach. Your faith isn't really that useful to you. It's an insurance policy that can be turned to when things go bad, and they will. It's a nice thing to do when there's nothing else to do, but it's not steady or reliable or adding much value. You're stuck in 8th grade. The third place, the most useful approach, is what I would call committed followers. So I commit to following Christ, and what I'm committing is my life. Probably not all at once, but maybe a little bit more today than yesterday, or a little bit more tomorrow than today. And here's the thing. That commitment on my part isn't giving and sacrifice for the sake of giving and sacrifice. Giving on my part is always matched and outmatched by God's giving. This exchange responds to the deepest desire of our hearts. Because the deepest desire of our heart is to spend our life committed to things of eternal value. Now you might say, well, that's my commitment to my family. I'm already doing that. And that's true. So you're right to say that. But even that commitment, if it is not rooted in faith, runs the risk of becoming disappointing, or even worse, heartbreaking. Growing commitment to Christ is simply the most useful way to live, and gradually awakens us to the deepest desires of our hearts. Well, in today's gospel, Jesus tells a story, and like many of his stories, it's unexpected. The story starts with a widow, and in that society, widows could be quite disadvantaged and impoverished. This widow, however, is speaking up for herself about something, and we don't really know what, doesn't mention it. But she is speaking up for herself, and she keeps speaking. She keeps badgering this powerful but corrupt and lazy judge for a decision on her behalf. Now, the poor widow eventually comes out on top, not because she outsmarted the guy, but as the judge himself says, though I have no fear of God and no respect for anyone, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice. The woman wouldn't give up, and ultimately, she's successful. A growing commitment to Christ that persists through joy and sorrow, blessing and sacrifice is the most useful way to live, and ultimately, it is the most successful. So after Mass today, take some quiet time. Ask yourself, evaluate yourself, where am I? What's my next step? If you're looking for help on taking your next step, whatever is the right next step for you, we have some help for you on our website. Just go to stalphonsus.net and click on Next Steps. And if you're ready to plug yourself into ministry in any capacity, because we all have gifts and talents to share, we have a lot to offer. So stop by the welcome desk or see any member of our parish staff, and we'll be glad to help you out. What is your next step? What's the next step that's right for you? What is the next step to move on forward to a more useful faith?